Well, bonjour tout le monde. Un grand plaisir de vous voir. I think you'll agree with me that we have been seeing some interesting headlines on the topic that we're going to talk about today. So first, we saw a headline that the President of the United States, as one of his first acts, made a commitment that he was going to use economic power to break the economy of Canada and to compel us to surrender our sovereignty and our independence. And then on the basis of transparent lies, began a program of economy-busting tariffs on Canada, the United States' closest trading partner. And then he followed this up recently by declaring a global war on penguins. And then we discovered something that we didn't know, which is that declaring a war on penguins is more scary than declaring a war on Canada. And so after only a few days of watching the stock market melt and the bond market melt down because of this act, he blinked. And we got to watch the video of the US trade representative in front of Congress. I don't know if you dote on these things, but I've had to lately. And the US trade representative being interrogated by Congress people clearly did not know that this was happening. And so we got the spectacle of one of the most senior US officials in the US government directly on this issue, who clearly did not know that policy on this matter is being set on a golf course and being announced on Twitter. So one of our guests here today must have watched that, feeling a little wry, because she used to work with the US trade representative, and so but for the grace of God, that could have been you, sister. And our other guest, who also knows something about appearing in front of parliamentary committees, must have also watched it, thinking the same. In any event, Beth and Steve are some of the most senior people on the globe working on these issues, and thank you so much for joining us today. We're privileged to have you. Please welcome our guests again. So we're going to get right into it here. So my first question is to Beth. So Beth, I want to start on a note of optimism now that the penguins are on our side. What's a progressive trade policy in 2025 in this era of increasing government by the authoritarian right? And are working people in the US persuadable that that would be a better option?
Merci beaucoup. Thank you so much. C'est un grand plaisir d'être ici avec vous aujourd'hui. I love this question. I love the title of this panel because it has the word power in it. Your question has concerns about authoritarianism in it, and it's about what a progressive trade policy is. So I'm inspired by the young people who were speaking this morning and the people I see out in the audience. The touchstone for us on progressive policy, progressive economic policy in the US is, of course, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt came to power in the 1930s, around the same time as Hitler. He was deeply affected by the loss of democracy in Europe, and that informed his approach to the New Deal. It was about making sure that we don't have economic precarity for working people, because economic precarity is what leads to authoritarianism. So the New Deal at its core was about the balance of power between working people and the robber barons, the tycoons, the people with excess corporate power coming out of the Gilded Age. So we wanted to strengthen labor unions. We had the Wagner Act, really supporting the right to organize and bargain collectively, freedom of association, and also a very robust anti-monopoly policy so that you're putting some constraints on those corporations. Here's the trade part that was forgotten. When it came time to think about what kind of global trading system we were going to have after the war, FDR's original vision was not tariff cuts as the pathway to peace and prosperity. It was to internationalize the New Deal. He worked with Canada, he worked with the United Kingdom, he worked with other countries, and then negotiated a charter, the International Trade Organization Charter, that had in it fair labor standards and anti-monopoly rules. So that power balance from the New Deal was meant to be infused in the rules that it would have governed the multilateral trading system. Those rules didn't come to pass because big business in the United States didn't like it. It was too Keynesian. It was all about full employment and industrial policy. And so it never entered into force. As we think, and this was something we spent a lot of time on in the Biden administration last year, recognizing this resurgence of authoritarianism, recognizing inequality, and looking at the International Trade Organization Charter as reflecting a truly progressive trade policy. I think the question for us is, what can we take from that in 2025, but also for the young people here, for the next generation? What do we do in 2025, and what do we do beyond? And I think if you root it in that understanding of the power of working people, you do get organized labor on board.
Okay, I hope you all caught that. We're talking about global trade, and that was a note of hope. So Steve, is there such a thing as a progressive trade policy? And is it imaginable in today's world, the growing authoritarian right?
Well, I think there certainly is such a thing as progressive trade policy. I think that's where a large part of the world was headed before we had the Trump administration come into office. I think now we've seen that that is not going to get us very far with this administration. Much of that is going to be rolled back, I expect, in these agreements he's talking about. So I view this as a setback to progressive trade policy. I think it'll probably come back, but it's going to be a rough ride for a few years.
Let's just do a little follow-up on this. Trump, when he was doing his penguin tariffs, made a point of having workers from the UAW up there to support them. And so it seemed like labor solidarity was fracturing across the border, and at least those voices were saying it works for working people to go down this road of these of breaking international trade. So is there a path where working people sign up again for progressive trade policy as opposed to what's on offer from the current president?
This is where the United States has been in an unusual position because of the size of its market and because of the amount of consumption that exists in the United States, which is very attractive to every other country's exports. If you have a system that is principally based on tariff cuts and hasn't seen that power dynamic, we just have to reckon with the fact that trade agreements in the United States have been used to break labor power. And organized labor knows it. That is something we have to correct for. Some workers in the United States hear the word tariff and it says to them, oh, you get that the old way wasn't working for me and you want to do something else. And that is the appeal. If we do a better job, for me, a lot of trade policy in the United States is also domestic policy. We should be trying to repeal Taft-Hartley. That should be part of the trade conversation. If you do that, if you map out a pathway where you're seeing workers and really recognizing the ways in which we went about trade policy undermine their bargaining position, then you can get them to understand that what you're trying to do is advance a trade policy that has their interests at the core. That was at the heart of the worker-centered trade policy that we in the Biden administration were pursuing.
Do you want to comment on that, Steve?
No.
Very wise. Okay, so I'm going to, if you're noticing that I'm reading these questions, I have to tell you, if you want to see what tough bargaining is like, you should see what it's like to talk about panel questions to these two. So I'm keeping my end of the bargain by sticking to what we agreed on. But that doesn't mean they're not going to be ornery, so here's one for you. So our Prime Minister Carney said a few days ago, and I quote, "It's clear that the United States is no longer a reliable partner." And he said, we will need to dramatically reduce our reliance on the United States. We will need to pivot our trade relationships elsewhere. Is he right? And if he is right, how do we do that?
Well, as usual, things are a little more complicated than that. I think we should be doing whatever we can to reduce our reliance on the U.S. market. They clearly have shown us that they're an unreliable partner. We should be getting more out of our domestic market by reducing internal barriers. That would certainly be helpful. We should be getting more. We should be positioning ourselves to be able to get more out of many of our resources by finding ways to get them to markets more than we have been. And we should be getting more value out of the other 14 free trade agreements we have with another 50 countries, and trying to make sure that we can have a stronger trading relationships with all of those. But none of those measures are short-term fixes in any of that. Other markets in particular can be very difficult to get into. We've spent a lot of time doing regulatory alignment with the US. Regulations in Europe and in Asia are different. We'd have to ask our companies to be able to produce to different regulatory standards, different food and safety standards on the agriculture sector, and all of that is not necessarily the easiest thing to do. And then we could be left with asking companies to produce to standards for the US to the extent that we still have market access, and have a second set of standards to produce to other markets, or a third, potentially two, depending on where they're going. So it's not an easy thing to do. I think that just as Trump is trying to achieve what he's trying to achieve in a very short period of time, and that's not going to happen, it would be very difficult for us to diversify to that extent in a very short period of time too. So the other challenge that companies have is, do I invest the time and resources into positioning my business to be able to sell to these other markets, knowing there's a very strong possibility that these issues with the US could be temporary, and in 2 years or in 3 years, we could be back to having reasonable terms of access again. So I think at the end of the day, we have to accept that we do have to have some kind of trading relationship with the US, maybe different than the one we have now, but we do have to expect that we've got to sort that out somehow. They need us, we need them, but we've got to figure out a new way of trying to have a trade relationship. So I think that's where we'll need to head. 2/3 of our GDP is tied to trade. 75% of our exports go to the US. We can't turn around that quickly. And frankly, the US will always be an easier market to get into once we get past, and I think we will, this particularly contentious period.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on this, Beth?
It strikes me that one of the lessons of the pandemic was to expose that for the last 30 or 40 years, the mantra was that interdependence is good and fragmentation is bad. And where that led us was to a kind of interdependence that created risk and vulnerability in the system. And when I hear Canada talk about how it needs to position itself, or the Europeans about how they need to position themselves, it reminds me of the conversation we were having in the Biden administration about how you manage for dependencies and risks. I would just flag, we put out a paper in January on our way out on adapting to supply chain resilience. I think that paper is still on the USTR website. It might be helpful for people who want to look at that as you think about what your pathway to diversification looks like.
So let me put my next question to you. Is there any prospect, either acting alone or in concert with other democracies, that Canada and Canada's allies could dissuade the US from its present course? Is there any hope here that we can bring this in for a soft landing, or are we in for the tough time that Steve was just alluding to?
There's a couple of reactions. If other governments affirmatively attempt to dissuade, It's going to potentially reinforce the perception that there is this extractive relationship that the president is, in his mind, correcting for. So I would discourage that. I do think that tearing down internal barriers in Canada, and for the European Union, if they figure out how to do the single market, and that's 450 million people with consumption power similar to what the US has had, that's very powerful. And of course, Canada and the EU already have a trade agreement. So my advice to countries is figure out what's in your best interest and figure out how to do that, and let the Americans and perhaps American bond traders figure out how to solve for our internal challenges.
Yeah, no, I think there are things Canada can do, and Canada with the rest of the world to pressure the U.S. to go in a different direction. I think what we've seen just yesterday with the U.S. backing off the so-called reciprocal tariffs fairly quickly, with the exception of China, it demonstrated that the U.S. administration can feel that kind of pressure. I think given that Canada has retaliated against steel and aluminum tariffs and on autos tariffs and the initial tariffs related to fentanyl, I think retaliation can be a useful tool, and it's unfortunate that most of the rest of the world didn't see it that way, because I think if there had been a more coordinated response from countries around the world, then we could have seen this fall away even more quickly. And I think in this intervening period where we've got 90 days and countries are going to see if they can negotiate something with the U.S., if at the end of that 90 days we haven't made much progress and the U.S. reimposes the tariffs, if countries decided at that point that they should retaliate in some coordinated fashion, I don't think that they would last long. And I think that would be a significant rebuke to the U.S. about the merits of going in that kind of direction and completely obliterating trade laws that we've all operated under for the last 75 years.
Let's just pursue this a little bit, because this was kind of the heart of the matter of this council we're both on when we were kicking around what to do about this. And there was an argument that these kind of tariffs are an act of self-harm, and that the consequence for them is going to be to put the United States into a recession. And so you just let them do their work. And that seems to be what a number of the U.S. trade partners seem to be, I think Mexico, for example, basically playing that game. We took a different view, which was, and I think you and I both argued for this, that you cannot just lay in the road while your main trade partner runs you over, and that you have to show them that you're going to fight. Although, as you know, I always argued we couldn't do this alone.
Yes.
And so, is there sense in what, for example, Mexico was doing, that tariffs are an act of self-harm and you just let them work? Or are you hopeful that people will see it our way after they try all the alternatives?
Well, I think, first of all, Canada is now in a difficult position because many countries are not retaliating. Only China and Canada at this point, since the EU backed off their retaliation on steel and aluminum, postponed it this morning. So we're kind of isolated, and that's never a particularly good place to go. But I think with retaliation, there are two main reasons for retaliating. The first is to make sure that your trading partner feels some pain and is going to have some resistance internally to continuing down that policy direction. But the second part of the reason for doing retaliation, I think, is even more important. And we saw this in steel and aluminum when we did it the last time, during the last Trump administration. If you don't try to balance the negotiating table to some extent by putting measures on your own side that you're taking to counteract what the U.S. is doing in this case, you're not then in any kind of balanced position. And what you're doing is you're continuing to offer concessions and never knowing what the price is going to be at the end of the day. And that, I think, is not a great position to be in because the U.S. can just keep changing the price and keep raising the price, and it's very hard to get to a settlement that way. If both sides come to the table, you both have the initial measure and retaliation on that table, then you can start to have more of a balanced discussion. It gives you some leverage that you don't otherwise have.
So Beth, I don't want to put you in an awkward position here in commenting on Canada's bargaining tactics, but maybe I'll put this question to you this way. As a friend across the border, what do you think is more persuasive? Countermeasures, as Steve just outlined, to create a balance at the table, hoping that eventually you'll get to a rational bargaining place if we ever can with this administration? Or is penguin power and the meltdown of the bond market a more compelling piece of leverage on the U.S. administration?
I think it's hard to say what leverage points work, and people are trying different things with what I would describe as, shall we say, a mercurial policy. I do think it's really important to be respectful of every country's particular position, their particular leverage points, and every country's sovereignty. So Canada has a certain relationship with the United States, and a much broader one than just the trade relationship. And we should emphasize that the withdrawal of the security guarantee is so aggressive on top of everything else and really affects the whole conversation. Mexico is in a slightly different position. So I think it's appropriate for each of these countries to figure out what's right for them and what's right for their electorate, but also to recognize that the United States is not monolithic, and there are various elements in the United States who are reacting to the totality of the policies by expressing concern about the state of the American economy, and that seems to be having some effect.
Okay, so my next question is to Steve. So, a lot of people in Canada and around the world have been watching all of this and going, what is going on here? What are they trying to achieve? What is this for? And I think there was quite an important meeting that followed Ontario's move on electricity that was conducted with Minister LeBlanc and Premier Ford and officials from the U.S. administration, where it seemed that the Trump people were putting their cards on the table a little bit more than we were hearing elsewhere. And as I understand it, you can maybe confirm whether I understood this, they basically said, look, at the end of the day, what we're up to here is we want a full repatriation to the United States of steel production, aluminum production, automobile manufacture, pharmaceuticals, and forestry. And when they talk about full repatriation, what they're talking about, for example, is what Mr. Trump was saying, that every car sold in the United States will be fully manufactured in the United States, and similarly for those other production. So you could say that at least we understand what they're trying to do. We're mindful that this is the gut, the heart of the Canadian economy to some extent. So is that, is what I just said true, do you believe? Do you think it's a reasonable goal for the United States to pursue that? Should we mirror them? Should we follow a similarly autarkic policy and say, well, we'll have a new national policy and we'll create our own autarkic industries too? And what do you think about this piece of the puzzle?
Well, I think that is one of the primary objectives, particularly for President Trump, to bring a lot of these industries back to the U.S., have them fully produced within the U.S., and he sees those as not only economic issues, but strategic issues in many ways. But if you take those sectors like autos, steel, aluminum, lumber, pharmaceuticals, likely copper to come, others to come in the future as well. All of these sectors are very closely integrated in the North American economy and to some extent with the rest of the world as well. So the notion of trying to take apart that integrated economy, reshore all of the elements of it within the United States or any particular country is very expensive. It will take a very long time to do it. It's not a 2 or 3 year project. In many cases, it would be more like a 10-year project, which may be well beyond Trump's mandate, hopefully. I think that it's not only very expensive, it takes a long time, but at the end of it all, you end up with a far less competitive industry than you had to start with. So unless you have no intention of ever competing with imports or ever exporting that product, you're going to pay a lot more for it, and you're going to have a lot of other of the same product being produced much more cheaply. And I think if you take aluminum, it's a good example. The US produces about 50% of their aluminum needs, and they import the rest of the other 50%. Canada is by far the largest supplier of that aluminum, but if the US tried to move towards 100% aluminum production to fill their economy, it would cost them the equivalent of constructing 4 more Hoover dams and much more than $100 billion to do that. And again, they'd still be left with a far less competitive sector in relation to aluminum producers around the world. So it doesn't make a lot of sense. I don't think it makes sense for Canada to go down that track either, because I think that same thing on autos, there's a lot of parts that we don't produce in Canada. If we tried to replicate all of those parts, all of that parts production within Canada, again, very long time, very expensive, and we end up with an uncompetitive industry. And given that Canada is a fairly small market, you know, we may have a choice of 1 or 2 cars that we would be able to buy that were Canadian manufacturers. But just on this, it's interesting to look at autos because Canada has about 8% of the population of North America, and we produce about 8% of the cars in the North American market. So there's already a very close match between what each country, the size of each country's population, and the number of cars that are produced. So I think we need to find some way to come back to this notion that we build cars together and we're all better off for it.
Especially for Canada and Mexico, I don't know how firm the commitment to true autarky in these sectors really is. We'll find out. But we can also see some of the actions potentially as establishing a negotiating position for, you call it CUSMA, we call it USMCA. I was surprised to see the tariffs on auto parts made in Canada and Mexico, because the whole point was to integrate these industries and treat those parts as equal. It's part of the reason I think people are surprised to see UAW workers in the Rose Garden. There is solidarity across labor movements in North America. That matters. And I get the feeling people are wondering if that's still true. I think it is still true. And so if it's possible that that's a negotiating position for purposes of USMCA, that's one way for Canada and Mexico to look at the totality of the actions. The other piece of it for us, we did take away when we were in office from the pandemic that we had a supply chain concentration problem and that we needed to think about ways to diversify away. And we were critical of the flaws in the global trading system that contributed to those outcomes, and that I think is also part of the solution. What is a progressive trade policy? Seeing what drove those outcomes, which were so bad for people, including our frontline workers. We were never about reshoring absolutely everything to the United States, because that is also not going to be resilient. What you want is diversification and different nodes of production in different places, so that when there is a pandemic or when there is an earthquake or some kind of disaster, including unfortunately war, you've got someplace else to go to be able to source those goods. To me, that is the missed opportunity of not having democracies come together and say, How are we going to devise a system that allows all of us to have opportunities to make things throughout the supply chain and ensure that we have a more resilient global economy for whatever shock comes next?
But I think we should just spend a little bit more time on this one, because I think it might be the heart of the matter. So look, Trump, like the authoritarian right, all through the democratic world, and we see this in Canada with our own authoritarian right, is appealing to working people, directly appealing to working people, and saying, you've been betrayed by the progressives who governed you for the last 20 to 30 years. Look at what has happened to you. The welfare went to a handful of people. You can't afford housing, you can't afford food. Your children are not going to have the kind of future you had. It's their fault. And we're going to act directly and with force to bring your jobs back from where they were exported to the benefit of a few. And then we're going to get back to the glorious ways that things were in whenever America was great, which, depending on the day, Mr. Trump seems to feel is either the 60s, the 50s, or maybe the 1890s. Still a little hard to tell. And if it's true that those 5 industries are basically what they're targeting, those industries are about the 7 swing states that elected Trump. They're about speaking to working people in the Rust Belt, if you will, in the United States, and saying we're going to reopen the steel mills in Pennsylvania. We are going to bring back auto manufacturing to Detroit, and the 1 million people who have left Detroit will come back. So I think there's a political agenda here, a direct political agenda, and an effort to bring hope to working people, to break, kind of the inherent majority that was behind the Democratic Party, and to create a new majority that will give us many Trumps to the future. And so if that's the case, then what are we putting up against that? What's the hope against that for working people? Where do working people see hope that isn't in the agenda of an authoritarian right that is promising to get back to the way things used to be, that people were being persuaded was better than what they got now? What do you think?
So now you know why I keep going back to FDR, because he confronted these exact same challenges, and his solution was economic policies to shrink inequality. Those swing states also voted for Joe Biden. And there is that side of President Biden that is Scranton Joe, whose father lost his job and couldn't put food on the table, who really connected with working people. Joe Biden walked the picket line with UAW. For me, if I could give a plea to my own party in the States, it is for us to remember what that FDR coalition was and to rebuild it, and to really recognize that there are some challenges with the way we design the global trading system that hurt working people in the United States. And it's a reality that people do not want to wrestle with. They went to university, they took the economics classes, all free trade is good trade. That's just not the reality that we saw for a lot of working people. So the affirmative part of this is that you can do a progressive trade policy. You can have good relationships among countries, but it has to be grounded in economic security for working people, and not for American workers at the expense of Mexican workers or South African workers. It's gotta be economic security for working people all over the world. And so I'll come back to it. That's why I love the title of this panel, because it's got the word power in there. And my boss was at a conference last year. It was an antitrust conference, and the title of it was Power versus Price. And if we think more about power and that workers are part of our economy, and less about price, that everyone's only a consumer, we will find our way towards a positive trading system.
And don't let them tell you it can't be done, as we like to say here. So Steve, I'll just stay in this one for a minute longer. So let's say I was right, and that's the political logic behind what's going on here. So in consequence, we're not just talking about numbers and about a business play. We are talking about a theory of the case to keep the Republicans in office indefinitely in the United States by breaking the Democratic coalition and getting working people, those UAW workers, to reaffiliate with the Republicans in the long term. Does that not make it much more difficult to imagine that the tools we've been talking about will dissuade them from their course? Since at the end of the day, if they don't have this, what have they got to win their elections in the future?
Yeah, well, I think it's an issue that the Trump administration in particular is looking at very simply, and I think there are many more aspects to it that aren't being considered, because I think when you do talk in particular about a progressive kind of approach, one of the avenues that trade policy can use to address that is really when you get, you look at trade as being fair trade on a level playing field, and you're heading down a path that companies and workers can compete on a more fair basis. So if you look at labor standards, then having low labor standards shouldn't be a competitive advantage into markets that have higher labor standards. If one country has virtually no environmental standards, and as a result can produce much, much more cheaply than, say, in North America, there should be some adjustment made so that that's not an advantage against workers that are having to live with higher environmental standards and the higher costs that come with those. So that's an area of trade policy that really needs to be worked on so that we can look at what a level playing field looks like from that perspective, and not with unfair advantages because you have lower standards. So I think that's something that we need to try to keep holding on to, even though we're in this new regime. And I think the other issue is that we need to stop thinking about trade policy and trade agreements in a silo, because trade is a very brute instrument. It's very crude, and was always intended to be worked with domestic policy, because trade will provide benefits to economies, but it's up to domestic policies to figure out how to distribute those benefits, how to ensure there's some degree of equality in those getting the benefits. And I think that's an issue that too often gets ignored. So we see very quickly rising inequality in the US. We're seeing the current administration wanting to have even higher tax cuts at the highest end. There's going to be more problems coming from that than there are from trade at the end of the day, in my view.
Okay, so we're in the last 2 minutes of this panel, which was going to be followed by another one on the same topic. And we're going to hear from our labor leadership, talk about how we navigate this. So I'm going to throw this last question to both of you. I'll start with Steve, and then Beth, you'll wrap us up. So here's what we'll wrap on. Should we take Trump's threat to our sovereignty and independence seriously, or is this another passing moment, let's say? And how do you think this is going to end?
Well, I think first of all, his comments about our sovereignty, I think almost all Canadians find them completely offensive and insulting, and they have no place in the discourse between leaders and should not have. But I think when President Trump said it, he probably meant what he was saying, or probably believed what he was saying. I think he basically likes the look, how getting rid of that border would look on a map. I'm not sure the analysis has been much more sophisticated than that. But I think that what we're really seeing is that, we're not hearing as much of it lately. I think that's obviously a good thing. I think we should look forward to completely having this as something that's now been done and over, and we're moving on to something that's much more real and much more legitimate.
Okay, and then how do you think it's going to end?
Sorry?
Be a predictor. How do you think this is going to end?
How do I think it's going to end? I have no doubt how it's going to end. We won't be the 51st state. We will maintain our sovereignty. And I think President Trump is going to have enough challenges with the rest of his term, and I think if he was serious about trying to do this, this would be by far the biggest challenge of his term, and another one that he would fail.
Well, Beth, over to you on these light questions. Is there anything else you'd like to say to us as we wrap up?
On the how will this end, sort of generally, what was the Gilded Age? The Gilded Age was robber barons and extreme inequality. It was the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. It was the meatpacking conditions that led Upton Sinclair to write The Jungle. We know that that was unsustainable for working people. And what followed the Gilded Age? The New Deal followed the Gilded Age. So that is my pathway for us. Where we end up is to complete the New Deal. It wasn't racially equitable because of segregationists in Congress. The Great Society was a step towards that. But I think that is where we are ultimately going to end up.
Okay, well, we couldn't have had two better informed guests to kick off our discussion about this. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. That was fascinating.